I never thought I would be sitting in a courtroom watching my own father look at me like I was a stranger, like an enemy, like someone he had already decided to crush. But that morning, as I sat on the hard wooden bench with my hands shaking in my lap, I realized something important. This was never just about money, it was about control. The room smelled like old paper and cold air, every sound felt louder than it should have been. The soft cough of a lawyer, the scrape of a chair, the quiet whisper of people who thought my life was just another case to watch. But for me, this was everything: my past, my future, my safety, my dignity. All of it was sitting in that room waiting to be torn apart. My name is Emma, and until a few months ago, I believed I had a complicated, but still normal relationship with my father. I thought he was strict, proud, distant, sometimes cold, but still my dad, the man who taught me how to ride a bike, who told me education was my only shield in this world, who said family was everything. I held on to those words for years, even when his actions slowly stopped matching them. My mother died when I was 16, and after that something in him changed, or maybe it had always been there and I was just too young to see it. Grief made him harder, quieter, more controlling. He started checking where I went, who I talked to, how I spent money that wasn't even his. At first it felt like concern, but concern turned into rules, rules turned into threats, and threats turned into fear. By the time I graduated college, I was exhausted, not just tired, but drained in a way that sleep could not fix. I had worked 2 jobs, studied late nights, and saved every dollar I could. My mother had left me a small inheritance. Not much, but enough to help me feel secure enough to breathe. For the first time, it was in my name, legally protected, something she had planned quietly before she passed, like she knew I would need it. When my father found out, everything shifted overnight. He didn't ask. He demanded. He said as the head of the family, he had the right. He said I owed him for raising me, for feeding me, for giving me a roof over my head. Every word felt like a bill being read aloud. One I had never agreed to, one I could never afford to pay. I said no, and that was the first time I ever truly stood up to him. His face didn't show anger. At first it showed something worse, calm disappointment, like I had failed a test he had designed just to watch me fall. He warned me, then his voice low, controlled, that I would regret it. I didn't understand what he meant, not fully, not until the court papers arrived. The lawsuit felt unreal, like it belonged to someone else. My hands shook as I read his name listed as the plaintiff, mine, as the defendant. He was demanding full control of my assets, everything my mother left me, plus what I had earned myself, claiming I was irresponsible, incapable, manipulated by outside influences. He painted me as a child who couldn't be trusted with her own life. I wanted to scream, I wanted to call him and beg him to stop. Then I remembered all the nights I cried alone, all the times I felt small in my own home, all the moments I swallowed my fear to keep the peace, and something inside me hardened. I decided I would not beg anymore. Walking into the courthouse that first day felt like walking into a storm without an umbrella. My father didn't look at me when he passed by. His lawyer whispered something to him, and they both smiled. That smile stayed with me. It felt like a knife pressed gently against my back as I sat there waiting for the judge. I kept thinking about my mother, her quiet strength, the way she would squeeze my hand when my father raised his voice. The way she would tell me, Emma, always keep your own name, your own money, your own way. I finally understood why she had been so careful, why she had planned in silence. She had seen this coming. This case wasn't just about assets. It was about my freedom, about whether I would spend the rest of my life asking permission from a man who saw love as ownership, control as care, and obedience as respect. The judge entered and everyone stood. My heart pounded so loud I was sure others could hear it. My father's lawyer spoke first, confident, smooth, every word carefully chosen to make me look weak, careless, ungrateful. They talked about tradition, authority, responsibility, family duty. Then it was my turn, or at least it felt like it should be. But my lawyer leaned toward me and whispered something that surprised me completely. She said, "Let him talk. Let him show who he really is." That was when I realized this story wasn't starting here in this courtroom. It had started years ago in small moments, in silence, in fear, in choices I didn't even know I was making. And whether I knew it or not, everything had been leading to this point. As my father took the stand and began to speak, I watched him closely, really watched him for the first time, not as my parent, but as a man who believed the world owed him loyalty without question. He spoke about sacrifice, about being betrayed by his own daughter, and I felt a strange calm settle over me because I knew something he didn't. He thought this was his victory lap. He thought the court would hand me back to him, neatly packaged and obedient. He had no idea that every demand, every lie, every exaggerated story was building something else entirely. And as I looked down at the folder on my lap, heavy with documents my mother had prepared long ago, with records, with proof, with truths that had never been spoken, I understood that this was only the beginning. This was the moment where my fear ended and my plan quietly began. When people hear about a father suing his own daughter, they always ask the same question: what happened? What went wrong? But the truth is, nothing went wrong all at once. It happened slowly, quietly, in ways that are easy to ignore until it is too late. After my mother's death, our house became smaller, even though the walls never moved. Every room felt watched, every decision felt judged. My father had a way of standing in doorways, arms crossed, eyes narrow, saying nothing, and somehow saying everything. I learned to read his moods like weather patterns. Calm meant stay invisible. Storms meant agree quickly. I told myself it was grief. I told myself he was hurting like I was, that we were both just trying to survive loss. But grief does not explain control. Grief does not explain why he started opening my mail, or why he asked for passwords, or why he decided who I should be friends with. Grief does not explain why he kept reminding me that without him I would have nothing. Money became his favorite language, even when it was not his money. He liked to remind me how much things cost, how expensive my education was, how lucky I was that he allowed me to stay in the house. He never used the word allow directly, but it lived in every sentence. When I started working part-time, he asked to see my pay slips, said it was just to help me budget. He suggested I give him access to my account so he could make sure I was not wasting money. I refused politely, then firmly, and that was the first crack I saw in his mask. He laughed. Then a sharp sound with no warmth, and said, "You think you know better than me now, is that it?" I remember feeling embarrassed, guilty, even though I had done nothing wrong. That was his gift, making you doubt yourself without ever raising his voice. My mother had always been the buffer between us. She softened his edges, explained his behavior, made excuses. I now realized she was protecting me in the only way she knew how, absorbing his anger so it would not fall on me when she was gone. There was no shield left. The inheritance was never supposed to be a secret. But my mother asked the lawyer to delay telling my father. She said Emma will need time to grow into herself before she is ready to stand up to him. I didn't understand then, but I do now. The money sat untouched for years, not because I was afraid to use it, but because it represented something fragile: independence, choice, safety. I was scared that if I touched it, he would sense it, somehow, like a predator smells fear. The day he found out was not dramatic at first. He just went quiet, too quiet. He asked how much, where it was kept, who managed it. I answered carefully, truthfully, still hoping honesty would protect me. It didn't that night. He came to my room without knocking, stood there like a judge, and said that money should be under my control. I laughed nervously, thinking he misspoke. He didn't correct himself. He repeated it slower. I told him my mother left it to me. His jaw tightened. He said, "Your mother made mistakes." I didn't respond. He said, "She filled your head with ideas about independence, like you don't need family." I finally spoke then and said, "I am family." He stared at me for a long moment, then turned and walked away. I slept with my door locked that night for the first time in my life, not because I thought he would hurt me physically, but because I knew something had shifted from that day on. Every conversation felt like a negotiation. He would mention bills, groceries, repairs, always ending with a look that said, "You know what you should do?" I started staying out later, finding reasons to be away, working extra shifts just to avoid the pressure. When I moved out, he accused me of abandoning him, of choosing money over blood. He told relatives I was being manipulated, that I had changed. They stopped calling one by one, his version of the story spreading faster than mine ever could. The court papers arrived on a rainy morning, the kind that makes everything feel heavier. I remember sitting on my kitchen floor staring at the envelope, my father's name printed neatly at the top. My hands went numb reading his claims, felt like watching someone rewrite my life in a language I didn't recognize. He said I was reckless, unstable, incapable. He said he feared I would waste everything my mother worked for. He said he was only trying to protect me. Protect me. The words burned because they were the same ones he used every time he crossed a line. Calling a lawyer felt like admitting this was real, like crossing a bridge that could not be uncrossed. But once I started speaking, once I told my story out loud, something strange happened. My voice didn't shake. I felt steady, grounded, like I had been waiting for this moment longer than I realized. My lawyer listened without interrupting, then asked a question that changed everything. "Do you have proof?" I thought about the folders my mother left me labeled carefully: insurance, property notes, emails, letters, things I had never fully read because they hurt too much. Suddenly they felt like armor as the court date approached. My father grew bolder. He sent messages, long paragraphs filled with guilt and blame, then short ones filled with threats. He said, "We can end this if you just do the right thing." The right thing meant surrender. I didn't reply. I saved everything, every message, every voicemail, every email. I stopped explaining myself. I stopped defending my choices. Silence became my strength. Sitting in that courtroom watching him perform hurt more than I expected. But it also clarified something. He was not fighting for me, he was fighting to win. And as he spoke about responsibility and tradition, I realized he had underestimated me in the one way that mattered. He thought I was still the girl who would stay quiet to keep the peace. He didn't know that peace was no longer my goal. By the time the judge called for a break, I was no longer afraid of what would happen next. I was curious because I knew the truth was heavy, and once it was placed on the table, it would change everything. When the judge called for a recess, my father walked out of the courtroom with his shoulders straight and his chin high, like a man who believed the outcome was already written. People stopped him, shook his hand, whispered support. I stayed seated, watching the way confidence wrapped around him like armor. My lawyer leaned toward me and asked if I was okay. I nodded, even though my chest felt tight, not with fear anymore, but with memory, because this was not the first time he had been sure of his power growing up. I learned early that disagreement was dangerous, not because it led to shouting, but because it led to silence. My father used silence like a weapon days. Sometimes weeks without speaking to me until I apologized for things I didn't even understand. When I was 12, I wanted to join a school trip. It cost money. He said no without explanation. I cried quietly in my room that night. The next morning, he left an envelope on the table with the exact amount needed, and a note that said, "Remember who provides for you." I thanked him and felt ashamed for wanting anything at all. That lesson followed me into adulthood. Need less, want less, ask less, survive quietly in the courtroom break area. I watched him laugh with his lawyer, the same laugh he used when he knew he had the upper hand. It stirred something deep inside me, a mix of anger and clarity. My lawyer asked me again if I had everything ready. I told her yes, but there was one thing she still had not seen: the letters my mother had written them over years, addressed to me, but meant for the future, pages filled with careful words about protection, boundaries, and truth. She never directly named my father, but she described behaviors, patterns, warnings, reading them after the lawsuit began. Felt like hearing her voice again, calm, steady, certain. She wrote about love that controls and how it slowly erases a person. She wrote about money as freedom, not greed, and about silence as survival, until it becomes a prison. She also wrote about evidence. She told me where to look, what to keep, what might matter someday. She knew she was sick. She knew she would not be there when the real fight came. So she prepared me in the only way she could back in the courtroom. My father took the stand again, this time answering questions from my lawyer. She did not attack him. She let him talk. She asked simple questions about finances, about accounts, about decisions he had made in the past. With every answer, he grew more confident, more careless. He admitted he had managed my mother's finances near the end of her life. He admitted he had tried to access my inheritance accounts after her death. He admitted he believed children owed their parents financial loyalty. When my lawyer asked if he had ever threatened me, he smiled and said, "Threatened is a strong word." I merely advised her. Advised. The courtroom shifted slightly at that word. I felt it like a ripple. Then came the messages. My lawyer read them aloud, one by one, the tone, the guilt, the pressure, the implied consequences. My father shifted in his seat. His lawyer objected, but the judge allowed it. Each message sounded colder when spoken aloud, stripped of the context he always relied on. Then my lawyer introduced the letters, my mother's letters. The judge read silently. At first, then asked for copies for the court record. My father's face changed, not anger, not fear. Something closer to being exposed. The room felt still, like everyone was holding their breath. My lawyer didn't dramatize the letters, she simply let them exist. She pointed out dates, patterns, consistency. She showed how my mother had anticipated financial coercion, how she had legally protected assets, how she had documented concerns. My father interrupted, once raised his voice, said she was confused, emotional. My lawyer calmly reminded him that the letters spanned years. The judge looked directly at him for the first time and asked if he had known about these concerns. He said no. Then the judge asked if he had ever sought to address them. Silence. That silence felt heavier than any argument. I watched my father struggle to maintain control, and for the first time I saw something human in him: uncertainty. The recess ended, and the judge announced the next phase would involve reviewing financial records in detail, not just mine, but his. My father stiffened. His lawyer leaned in, whispered urgently. I realized then that this case was no longer moving the way he expected. What he thought would be a simple demand had turned into a mirror, and mirrors have a way of showing things people work very hard to hide. As the session ended and we prepared to leave the courtroom, I felt something I had not felt in years: hope. Not the fragile kind, but the steady kind that comes when the truth finally has room to breathe. The days between court sessions felt longer than the years that led me there. Every hour stretched thin, filled with waiting and remembering and preparing. I tried to keep my routine: work, eat, sleep, but everything felt suspended, like my life was on pause, until a stranger in a robe decided my future. My father did not call me anymore. Instead, his lawyer sent formal messages, requests, demands, warnings. The tone was cold, professional, as if that made the threat cleaner, easier to swallow. I saved everything just like before. At night, I dreamed of my childhood house, long hallways, closed doors, rooms I was not allowed to enter. I would wake up with my heart racing, then remind myself I was safe. Now that house no longer owned me. My lawyer spent hours reviewing documents, bank statements, transfers, emails dating back decades. She kept saying one thing quietly to herself: patterns. She explained that courts do not just look at what someone claims, they look at behavior over time, intention, consistency, control. She said the story my father told did not match the paper trail. I asked her if that meant we would win. She didn't promise. She said something better. She said the truth is on your side, and that matters more than confidence. The next hearing focused on finances, my finances first. Then his. I sat there listening as numbers were read aloud, years of income, savings, investments, everything laid bare. It felt invasive but necessary. When they moved to his accounts, the air shifted. His lawyer spoke faster, objected more often, asked for breaks. My father stared straight ahead, jaw tight. They discovered attempts to move money between accounts shortly after my mother's death, transfers that were stopped, flagged incomplete. He claimed they were misunderstandings, clerical errors, good intentions. The judge did not respond immediately. Instead, he asked for documentation, timelines, explanations. The calmness of his voice felt more threatening than anger. Then came the trusts my mother had created, layers of protection. Conditions my father had dismissed as unnecessary at the time. She had been meticulous, each clause clear, each safeguard deliberate. My lawyer explained how these structures showed foresight, not confusion, planning, not manipulation. My father shook his head, muttering under his breath. When asked if he had ever discussed these trusts with my mother, he said no, then corrected himself, said briefly, then said he did not remember. The inconsistency hung in the room. A witness was called, my mother's longtime accountant, an older woman with steady hands and careful words. She testified that my mother had expressed concern about financial pressure, had asked repeatedly how to ensure her assets stayed with me. My father scoffed quietly. The judge noticed. The accountant described meetings, emails, instructions, all calm, all documented, nothing dramatic, just a woman trying to protect her child as she spoke. I felt my throat tighten. This was proof of love, not loud or showy, but precise and enduring. When the judge adjourned that day, he ordered a full review of my father's financial conduct during the years leading up to and following my mother's death. Outside the courthouse, reporters waited. This time, my father avoided them. His confidence cracked just enough to be visible. He finally looked at me, then really looked, and for a moment I thought he might say something human, something honest. He didn't. He turned away and walked off, surrounded by people who suddenly seemed less sure. On the drive home, my lawyer said something quietly. He overreached that night. I sat alone in my apartment holding one of my mother's letters, the paper worn soft at the edges. She wrote, "If you ever feel guilty for choosing yourself, remember that survival is not selfish." I cried then, not from fear or sadness, but from release. For the first time, I understood that standing up for myself was not betrayal. It was inheritance. As the case grew larger, so did the pressure. My phone buzzed constantly with messages from people I had not heard from in years. Distant relatives, old family, friends, even neighbors from my childhood, all suddenly concerned, all suddenly interested in my choices. They asked how I could do this to my father, how I could drag family matters into public view, how I could be so cold. I learned quickly that the story had spread again, reshaped, polished to make me the villain. My father had always been skilled at controlling the narrative. Now he was losing control of the outcome, so he tightened his grip on perception. I stopped answering calls. I stopped explaining myself. There was no version of the truth that would satisfy people who only wanted comfort, not honesty. Inside the courtroom, the tone shifted from emotional claims to quiet calculation. Experts were brought in, forensic accountants, legal analysts, people who spoke in careful, measured language that left little room for drama. They showed timelines, charts, patterns. My father tried to interrupt once but was shut down by the judge. Each session peeled back another layer, not just of finances but of behavior, how often he attempted access, how quickly he reacted. When denied, how consistently he framed control as concern. My lawyer explained later that these patterns mattered more than any single action. Courts understand systems. They understand repetition between hearings. My father finally sent me a message himself, not through a lawyer, not dressed in legal language, just words. He said, "This is going too far. You are embarrassing the family." He said, "We can still fix this if you come to your senses." He said, "Remember everything I have done for you." I stared at the message for a long time, my hands steady, my breathing calm. Something had changed in me. The guilt no longer had teeth. I saved the message and said nothing. Another witness testified, a former business partner of my father. A man who described disputes over control money authority. He spoke carefully, but the story sounded familiar: demands, expectations, consequences. My father denied it, called it misunderstanding. The judge took notes with each testimony. I felt less like a child on trial and more like a person watching a system reveal itself. One afternoon during a break, my father stood close to me for the first time in months. His voice was low, urgent. He said, "You don't understand what you're doing. You are tearing everything apart." I met his eyes and said quietly, "This was already broken." He flinched, not dramatically, just enough to show the words landed. The next day, the judge issued a temporary ruling, freezing certain accounts, including some of my father's pending transactions. It was not a final decision, but it was a signal. His lawyer argued, protested, warned of consequences. The judge listened, then repeated the order outside the courtroom. My father lost his temper, raised his voice, accused me of betrayal, of greed, of disrespect. Cameras caught everything that clip played on the news that night. His words, raw, uncontrolled. People began to see what I had lived with for years. Support started to trickle in quiet messages from strangers, from people who recognized the pattern, who thanked me for standing up. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired, but also lighter, like a weight had shifted off my chest at home. I read my mother's letters again. One line stood out: "When truth is revealed, those who depended on shadows will panic." I slept deeply that night for the first time in weeks, because I knew the hardest part was coming and I was ready. The final hearings were scheduled closer together, as if the court itself was tired of the tension and wanted an ending. Every morning I woke up with a tight chest, then reminded myself that fear no longer controlled me. Preparation did. My lawyer walked me through what to expect. Final testimonies, closing arguments, questions from the judge. She told me to stay calm, to answer only what was asked, to let the record speak. My father arrived early each day. Now he sat alone, his usual circle gone, his confidence replaced by rigid posture and forced stillness. He no longer smiled when he testified again. His voice lacked its earlier certainty. He repeated the same points: duty, tradition, protection, but they sounded hollow against the evidence. The judge asked him directly why he believed he deserved control over my assets. He answered, "Because I am her father." The judge paused, then asked, "Is that the only reason?" Silence stretched when it was my turn to speak. I stood slowly, my legs steady, my voice clear. I did not attack him. I did not dramatize my pain. I spoke about facts, about boundaries, about my mother's intentions. I spoke about fear and how it shaped my choices. I said something that surprised even me. I said I loved my father, but love does not mean surrendering your future to someone else's control. The courtroom was quiet. My father stared at me, then looked away. Closing arguments were brief. By then there was little left to argue. The story was written in documents, in patterns, in consistency. The judge took time before ruling, days that felt longer than any before. I waited, not in panic but in reflection. When the decision came, I was in the courtroom, hands folded, heart steady. The judge ruled entirely in my favor. He denied my father's claims, upheld the trusts, affirmed my full control over my assets, and issued a warning regarding coercive behavior. My father sat frozen, as if the words had not reached him. The judge spoke directly to him about boundaries, about autonomy, about the difference between guidance and control. I did not look at my father when the gavel fell. I looked forward outside the courthouse. Cameras flashed, questions were shouted. I walked past them without speaking. My lawyer squeezed my shoulder later, alone in my apartment. I let myself feel everything: relief, sadness, grief for the relationship. I wished I had. My phone buzzed with a message from my father. Just 2 words: "You win." I did not reply. I placed my mother's letters back in their folder and closed it gently. The fight was over. But the lesson would stay with me forever, that standing up for yourself may cost you comfort, approval, even family. But it gives you something far greater. After the ruling, the world did not suddenly become quiet like I expected. Instead, it felt louder, sharper. Every sound carried weight because now there was space inside me where fear used to live. People assume that winning a case brings instant peace, but what it really brings is emptiness. The kind that asks, "Who are you now that you are no longer fighting?" The first few days I woke up disoriented, my body still bracing for impact, still expecting a threat that never came. My phone stayed silent, no court updates, no legal alerts, just time. Time felt unfamiliar. I went back to work. Co-workers congratulated me, carefully unsure what to say. Some avoided the topic entirely. Others asked questions I did not answer. I realized I no longer owed anyone explanations at night. Memories surfaced, not the loud ones but the quiet moments, the almosts, the what-ifs, the dinners that ended early, the conversations that never happened. I thought about my father alone in his house, surrounded by things he could no longer control, and for the first time I felt something close to compassion, not for his loss of power, but for his inability to love without it. He tried to contact me again, this time through a letter, handwritten, shaky, the words apologetic but conditional. He said he was hurt, confused, disappointed. He said he hoped I would one day understand his intentions. I read it once, then placed it in a drawer. I was not ready to respond, and I accepted that I might never be my lawyer. Checked in one last time to close files to confirm there were no appeals. She smiled and said, "You did well." I thanked her, but the truth was, she had only helped me say what had always been there. One afternoon I visited my mother's grave. The sky was pale, the air still. I sat on the grass and spoke out loud for the first time in years. I told her what happened, how she protected me even when she was gone, how her quiet planning became my shield. I promised her I would live fully, not cautiously, not apologetically. Slowly, I began making choices. Without fear, choosing where to live, how to spend my money, who to let close. Every decision felt radical because it was mine. I learned that independence is not loud, it is steady. It shows up in small moments, in boundaries kept in silence. Chosen. My father never apologized the way I needed him to. Maybe he never will, but I stopped waiting for it, because closure is not something someone gives you, it is something you claim. And as I stepped into a life shaped by truth instead of control, I finally understood the real inheritance. My mother left me not money, but freedom. Freedom did not arrive all at once. It came in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes overwhelming. There were days I felt powerful and clear, and others when I felt lost, unsure of who I was, without resistance to push against. For so long, my identity had been shaped by what I was not allowed to be: careful, obedient, quiet. Now the absence of those limits felt like standing in an open field without directions. I started small. I rearranged my apartment, moved furniture, threw out things I had kept only because they were gifts from people who made me feel guilty. I donated clothes that reminded me of old versions of myself. It felt symbolic but also necessary. I began saying no without explanation, no to extra work. I didn't want no to social plans that drained me, no to conversations that felt like interrogations. Every no felt like a small rebellion with each one. My confidence grew, not loud, not dramatic, just steady. Money no longer scared me. I took time to understand it, to learn how to manage, invest, plan. Not from fear of losing it, but from respect for what it represented: choice, safety, future. Sometimes I heard my father's voice in my head, warning, criticizing, doubting, but it grew quieter over time, replaced by my own voice. Calmer, kinder, more certain. One evening, I ran into an old family friend at the grocery store. She hugged me tightly and said, "Your father is not doing well." She said it with concern but also expectation, as if I was meant to feel responsible. I smiled politely and said I hope he finds peace, and meant it, without offering myself as the solution. That was when I realized how much I had changed. People still talked. Some supported me, others judged me, but their opinions no longer defined me. I learned that not everyone will understand your boundaries, and that is not your failure. I started therapy not because I was broken, but because I wanted to understand the patterns that shaped me. The therapist listened as I described control disguised as care, silence disguised as love. She nodded and said, "You survived an environment that required you to shrink." Those words stayed with me. I had spent years shrinking to fit someone else's comfort. Now I was learning how to take up space without apology. Some nights, grief hit hard, grief for the father. I wished I had grief for the years spent afraid, grief for the version of myself who thought endurance was love. I let myself feel it fully, instead of pushing it away. Healing, I learned, is not about erasing the past, but integrating it without letting it rule you. Months passed, seasons changed, the legal case faded into background noise, something people occasionally referenced but no longer defined me. Then one afternoon I received a call from my father's lawyer, not aggressive, not demanding, simply informational. My father had withdrawn from several business ventures, downsized. His life was quieter. Now I thanked him and hung up, feeling nothing dramatic, no satisfaction, no revenge, just distance. Distance can be merciful. I took a trip alone, my first ever solo journey, somewhere quiet with water and sky. I walked for hours thinking about nothing in particular, letting my thoughts come and go without judgment. I realized then that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the absence of fear. Fear had dictated my life for so long. Fear of disapproval, fear of punishment, fear of abandonment. Now that it was gone, I could finally hear myself think. I started writing, journaling, letters to myself. Reflections about what I wanted my life to feel like, not look like. Feel like: safe, curious, grounded, open. I met new people, slowly, intentionally choosing connection over familiarity, learning that comfort does not always equal health. One night I dreamt of my mother again. She was smiling, standing at a distance, watching me, not guiding, not warning, just witnessing. I woke up with tears and gratitude. I whispered thank you to the empty room for the first time since everything began. I was not looking back. I was moving forward, and I knew deep in my bones that whatever came next, I would meet it standing, not shrinking, not silent, but whole. As time moved forward, I noticed something unexpected happening. The story that once lived only inside me began to loosen its grip. I was no longer replaying court scenes in my head, no longer rehearsing arguments that were already finished. The past was still there, but it no longer demanded my attention. Every moment, instead, new questions surfaced. Who am I becoming now that survival is not my full-time job? What does happiness look like when it is not borrowed or conditional? These questions were quieter but deeper. I started noticing how my body reacted to peace. At first it felt unfamiliar, almost suspicious. Calm made me restless. I would catch myself waiting for something to go wrong, waiting for the next demand or accusation, when none came. My shoulders slowly began to relax. I realized how deeply my nervous system had been trained to expect threat. One afternoon I missed a deadline at work, something small, nothing serious, but my heart raced like I had committed a crime. I apologized too much, over-explained, waited for anger that never arrived. My manager simply nodded and said, "Fix it tomorrow." I sat at my desk afterwards, stunned that mistakes did not equal punishment. That moment taught me more than any court ruling ever could. I began practicing something radical for me: neutrality. Not everything needed a strong emotion. Not every interaction needed defense or justification. Sometimes things could simply be what they were. This shift did not mean I became numb. It meant I became present. I noticed joy in small, ordinary moments. Morning light through the window, the sound of coffee brewing, the feeling of walking without rushing. These moments had always existed, but I had been too tense to feel them occasionally. My father crossed my mind, not as an enemy, but as a distant figure. someone who belonged to an earlier chapter of my life. I wondered if he ever reflected if he understood what he lost, or if understanding would require facing parts of himself he avoided. I accepted that his journey was no longer mine to manage. That acceptance felt like setting down a heavy bag I had carried for years. Without realizing there were setbacks, of course, days when old guilt crept in, days when I questioned if I had been too harsh, too firm, too unwilling to compromise. On those days I returned to the facts, not the feelings. The facts were steady, they did not change. Facts grounded me. When emotions tried to pull me backward, I also began reconnecting with parts of myself that had gone quiet. Creativity, curiosity, play. I took a class just because it interested me, not because it led anywhere useful. That alone felt rebellious. I laughed more easily. Now laughed without scanning the room for approval or consequences. Laughter felt safe. One evening at a small gathering, someone asked about my family. I paused, then said, simply, "We are not close," and felt no urge to explain further. The conversation moved on, and so did I. That was when I understood how much power I had given to other people's curiosity in the past. I was learning to choose what parts of myself were public and what parts were sacred. Months later, I received another letter from my father, shorter than the last, less defensive, more subdued. He wrote about his loneliness, about regret, about age. I read it slowly, feeling empathy without obligation. I placed it beside the others. Not as evidence, not as leverage, but as history. I realized that forgiveness, if it ever came, would not be a dramatic moment. It would be a quiet internal decision made for my own peace, not his comfort. I no longer rushed myself toward it. Life continued to unfold in ordinary ways: work, friendships, routines, future plans, nothing cinematic, nothing loud. And that was exactly what made it beautiful. I had once thought healing would feel like triumph. Now I knew it felt like stability. Stability is underrated because it lacks drama, but it is the foundation everything else stands on. I began planning for the future, not just financially, but emotionally. Where did I want to live? How did I want my days to feel? What kind of relationships did I want to build? These questions felt expansive instead of frightening. I recognized patterns in new relationships more quickly. Now manipulation disguised as concern no longer fooled me. Control no longer felt familiar or comforting. It felt wrong. That awareness was my quiet superpower. One night while cleaning, I found an old photo of my parents from before I was born. They were smiling, arms around each other, strangers in a way. I studied the image, without judgment, without longing, just curiosity. People are complicated. Stories overlap, intentions twist, outcomes are rarely what we expect. That understanding softened me, not toward harm, but toward humanity. I learned that I could hold compassion without sacrificing boundaries, understanding without surrender. This balance felt like maturity earned through experience, not taught as another year passed. I noticed something profound. I trusted myself fully, not just in big decisions, but in everyday ones. I no longer second-guessed my instincts. They had been sharpened by years of watching, listening, surviving. Now they guided me forward. I did not know exactly where my life would lead, but I knew this: I would never again confuse control with love, and that knowledge alone made everything that came before worth surviving. By the time another year passed, I stopped measuring my life by milestones and started measuring it by how safe I felt inside my own thoughts. Safety became my new success. Not the kind that shows on paper, but the kind that lets you breathe deeply without bracing. I noticed how my body changed first. My sleep grew deeper, my jaw unclenched, my shoulders dropped without me reminding them. To the constant tension I had carried since childhood finally began to leave, like a guest who realized they were no longer welcome. I started waking up before my alarm, not from anxiety but from rest. I would lie still, listening to the quiet, noticing how different silence felt when it was chosen instead of enforced silence. Used to mean punishment, waiting, isolation. Now it meant peace with that. Peace came clarity. I saw my past with sharper edges, not softened by denial or blurred by fear, but clearly for what it was. And oddly enough, that clarity did not make me angry, it made me honest. I began to understand that my father did not wake up one day and decide to hurt me. He operated from a belief system where love equaled authority and authority equaled safety. That belief did not excuse his actions, but it explained their consistency. Understanding this freed me from the exhausting task of trying to change him. People often ask why I didn't just cut him off completely, why I left the door slightly open. The truth is, healing does not follow strict rules, it follows honesty, and my honesty was that I needed space. Not erasure. Erasing him would have meant erasing parts of myself, parts that survived, learned, adapted. I wanted integration, not amputation. During this time, I began mentoring younger women informally, friends of friends, co-workers, daughters of neighbors who sensed I had walked through something difficult and come out standing. They asked questions quietly, cautiously. How do you say no without guilt? How do you know when something is wrong even if it looks right from the outside? I never gave speeches, I just told. The truth, I told them that discomfort is information, that fear can be trained, and that love should not require you to disappear. Watching their eyes widen at these ideas reminded me how rare these messages still are. One evening after such a conversation, I sat alone thinking about the generational nature of control, how patterns repeat when they are unnamed, how silence protects harm more than it protects peace. I realized then that my story was not just about inheritance or courtrooms or money, it was about interruption. I had interrupted a cycle. That realization carried weight, not pressure, but responsibility, the kind that asks you to live intentionally so the interruption lasts. I began volunteering with organizations focused on financial literacy and autonomy, especially for young women and survivors of coercive environments. I didn't tell my full story often, but when I did, it landed not as drama but as validation. People recognized themselves in it, and that recognition sparked something powerful: agency in my personal life. Relationships shifted. Some friends drifted away, uncomfortable with my boundaries. Others grew closer, relieved by my honesty. I learned that true connection does not fear limits, it respects them. Romantic relationships changed too. I was no longer drawn to intensity, mistaken for passion or control, mistaken for care. I noticed how my body reacted to people who listened without fixing, who stayed without demanding. Those connections felt calm, and that calm felt right. I no longer chased approval from authority figures, bosses, mentors, elders. Their praise was welcome but not necessary. My worth did not fluctuate based on their mood. This internal steadiness was new and precious. Occasionally, my father would surface again, not in person, but in memory, triggered by a phrase or a look from someone else. Each time the reaction softened, the memory no longer hijacked my nervous system. That was how I knew healing was real, not because the memories vanished, but because they lost power. One afternoon, while cleaning out old boxes, I found childhood journals, pages filled with careful handwriting, hopes, worries, attempts to be good enough. I read them slowly with compassion for that younger version of myself who believed love was something you earned through compliance. I wanted to reach back through time and tell her that she was already enough, that she would one day stand in her own truth without apology. I could not change her past, but I could honor her survival. So I kept one journal page framed on my desk, not as a reminder of pain, but as proof of resilience. Life did not become perfect, no life ever does. There were still disappointments, losses, uncertainties, but now I met them without collapsing. Resilience is not hardness, it is flexibility, the ability to bend without breaking. I learned that boundaries do not make you lonely, they make room for the right people. I learned that power does not need to announce itself, it exists quietly in choice. I learned that justice does not always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like protection. Sometimes it looks like distance. Sometimes it looks like letting go. One evening I received news through a mutual contact that my father had fallen ill. Nothing life-threatening, but enough to remind him of mortality. I felt a pang of sadness, not panic, not obligation, just sadness. I sent a short message wishing him well, nothing more, nothing less. That choice felt balanced. He replied with thanks and nothing else, and that was enough. As I stood in my kitchen afterward watching the light fade, I thought about how far I had come from that courtroom bench, shaking hands folded tightly, trying to disappear. That version of me had survived the impossible. This version of me was living the possible. I understood now that revenge was never my goal, even when anger fueled me. Justice was, and justice arrived not in humiliation but in autonomy. Autonomy is quiet. It does not clap for itself, but it changes everything. I no longer needed to prove anything to anyone, not even myself. My life was mine, and that truth required no witnesses. As the night settled in, I felt grounded, present, complete, not because everything was resolved, but because I trusted myself to handle whatever came next. And that trust was the greatest victory of all. As another season turned, I noticed how differently I moved through the world. My steps were slower, not from hesitation, but from presence. I no longer rushed to outrun discomfort or stayed still to avoid conflict. I simply moved when it felt right. Time itself felt less like an enemy and more like a companion. I was no longer counting days toward relief or dreading the future. I was living inside moments, letting them unfold. One quiet morning, I sat by the window watching rain trace lines down the glass and realized something profound. I was not afraid of my own thoughts anymore. For most of my life, my mind had been a battlefield filled with rehearsed conversations, imagined confrontations, guilt loops, and what-ifs. Now it was mostly quiet, not empty, just calm, allowed reflection. I reflected on how often strength is misunderstood. People think strength is loud, unyielding, dominant. But real strength, I learned, is the ability to remain yourself under pressure without becoming cruel or small. My father had confused dominance with protection, authority with love. I had inherited none of that. Instead, I inherited discernment. Discernment is subtle, it does not shout, it listens. I began noticing it in everyday situations, how I sensed when something was off before words were spoken, how I trusted my instincts without demanding proof. First, those instincts had been honed in survival, but now they served growth. There was a moment one evening at a small gathering when a conversation turned uncomfortable. Someone made a dismissive comment about boundaries, calling them selfish, restrictive, unnecessary. The old version of me would have stayed silent, smiled, politely swallowed the discomfort. The new version spoke calmly and said, "Boundaries are how we show people how to treat us." The room went quiet. Then the conversation shifted. No drama, no argument, just a subtle recalibration. Afterward, someone thanked me privately, said they had needed to hear that. It struck me how often truth does its work quietly. My relationship with money continued to evolve. It was no longer a symbol of conflict or fear. It became a tool, a resource, something neutral and useful. I planned carefully, not from anxiety, but from intention. I invested in experiences, education, travel, rest. I learned that rest is not laziness, it is repair. There were days I did nothing at all and did not punish myself for it. That alone felt revolutionary. Occasionally, guilt still surfaced, usually triggered by old family expectations, voices that said you owe, you should, you must. When that happened, I did not argue with the guilt, I acknowledged it. Then asked, does this align with who I am now? Most of the time the answer was no. That question became my compass. I also began to understand forgiveness differently. It was not a finish line or a moral requirement. It was a process that moved at the speed of safety. Some days I felt closer to it, others not at all, and that was acceptable. Forgiveness, I realized, is not about excusing harm. It is about releasing the hope that the past could have been different. Releasing that hope freed energy for the present. I saw my father once from a distance at a public place. We did not speak. We did not make eye contact. I felt a wave of emotion pass through me, sadness, tenderness, grief, but it did not knock me down. It passed like weather. That was how I knew I had healed enough. He was no longer a storm in my life, just a memory with edges softened by time. I thought about how many people never reach this place because they are taught that endurance equals virtue, that loyalty requires self-abandonment, that silence is strength. Those lessons are heavy and they are passed down easily. Breaking them requires courage, not the dramatic kind, but the quiet, persistent kind. The kind that shows up day after day, choosing honesty over comfort, choosing clarity over illusion, choosing yourself even when it costs. I began writing more intentionally, not just journaling, but shaping my experiences into language that made sense to me. Writing became a way to integrate the past, not relive it through writing. I saw patterns. I had missed connections. I had not named resilience. I had underestimated. I realized my story was not unique, and that realization did not diminish it. It expanded it. It connected me to countless others, walking similar paths silently. That connection mattered. There were moments of doubt, of course, moments when I wondered if life would have been easier had I complied, had I surrendered, had I kept the peace, but those thoughts never lasted long because I knew the cost of that peace. It would have cost me myself, and that price was too high. One evening I hosted a small dinner, nothing fancy, just good food and conversation, surrounded by people who respected me, who listened, who laughed freely. The room felt warm, alive as I watched them. I felt a deep sense of gratitude, not for what I had gained, but for what I had protected: my sense of self, my autonomy, my voice. Those things once lost are difficult to reclaim. I had reclaimed them. The realization settled in quietly, like a final piece clicking into place. I did not need closure from my father, or validation from the court, or understanding from others. I was complete without their approval. That completeness did not make me invulnerable, it made me resilient. Resilience is not about never being hurt again. It is about trusting yourself to recover. I trusted myself now fully, deeply, without reservation, and that trust changed everything. As night fell, and the house grew quiet, I felt grounded, steady, whole. Not because the past was erased, but because it no longer defined the future. I had stepped out of survival and into authorship. My life was no longer a reaction, it was a choice. As I look back now, the story no longer feels like something that happened to me. It feels like something I walked through, something that shaped me without owning me. The distance between who I was and who I am feels vast yet connected, like two shores linked by a bridge built from difficult choices. The final lesson did not arrive in a courtroom or a letter or a conversation. It arrived quietly in everyday life, in the way I make decisions, in the way I respond to discomfort, in the way I trust myself without asking for permission. I once believed closure would feel like a door slamming shut, but instead it felt like a door left open behind me, not inviting me back, just allowing air to move freely. There was a morning not long ago when I realized I had gone an entire week without thinking about my father. Not with anger, not with sadness, not even with curiosity. The realization surprised me, not because I wanted to forget him, but because it showed me how fully my life had become my own. That is when I understood that freedom is not about cutting ties. It is about cutting control. Control had been the invisible thread running through every chapter of my life, shaping my reactions, my fears, my silence. Once it was gone, the story rewrote itself naturally, without force. I noticed how I spoke differently now, with less apology, fewer explanations. I no longer padded my truth to make it easier for others to digest. I learned that clarity is kinder than confusion. Even when it disappoints, people responded to this change in unexpected ways. Some stepped closer, drawn by the honesty. Others drifted away, uncomfortable with the absence of obligation. I let both happen without resistance. Letting go became a practice, not an event. I stopped clinging to who I thought I should be and allowed myself to become who I already was. This shift showed up in my body. My breath slowed, my posture softened, my voice steadied. I no longer braced for impact when expressing needs. I trusted that I could handle the outcome, and when outcomes were uncomfortable, I survived them. That confidence was earned, not imagined. I also learned to recognize peace when it appeared before. I used to mistake calm for boredom, stability for stagnation. Now I see them as fertile ground where real growth happens quietly beneath the surface. There is a humility in peace. It does not demand attention. It does not perform. It simply exists in that existence. I found joy, not the explosive kind, but the steady kind that lingers. I found joy in routines and small rituals, morning light tea cooling in my hands, music playing while I clean. These moments grounded me in the present, something I had avoided before because the present used to feel unsafe. Now the present feels like home. Sometimes I think about my mother and how much she understood without ever saying it. She knew that protection does not always look like confrontation. Sometimes it looks like preparation, foresight, quiet action. Her love was not loud, but it was precise and enduring. Through her, I learned that strength does not need an audience. I also learned that justice is deeply personal. What felt like justice to me was not revenge or punishment. It was autonomy, the ability to choose my path without fear. That autonomy reshaped every area of my life: work, relationships, rest, ambition. I began to ask myself not what should I do, but what feels aligned. Alignment became my guide when something felt wrong. I no longer forced myself to adapt. I paid attention. Discomfort was no longer an enemy. It was information. This awareness protected me from repeating old patterns. I no longer confused intensity with intimacy or control with care. I recognized red flags, not because I was hypervigilant, but because I was present. Presence changes everything. I realize that many people never experience this level of presence because they are constantly negotiating their worth, trying to earn safety from external sources. I had done that for years, and it nearly cost me myself. Now safety came from within, from trust. Built slowly through action and integrity. Integrity is not perfection, it is consistency between values and behavior. I honored my values even when it was inconvenient, even when it cost me comfort. That consistency built self-respect. Self-respect is quiet but powerful. It does not need to be defended. It is felt. With it came compassion, not the kind that sacrifices boundaries, but the kind that understands complexity. Without accepting harm, I could hold empathy for my father without reopening the door to control. I could wish him peace without offering myself as a solution. This balance was something I once thought impossible. It required maturity, patience, and honesty. As I moved forward, I stopped framing my story as one of betrayal and revenge. Even though those elements existed, I began to see it as a story of awakening. Awakening to truth, to agency, to self-trust. The betrayal hurt because it forced me to see reality without illusion. But that clarity ultimately saved me. I do not regret the fight. I regret only the years I believed silence was love. But even that regret softened as I recognized the context. I did the best I could with what I knew at the time. Self-forgiveness became part of the journey. I forgave myself for staying too long, for doubting myself, for believing I had to earn love. That forgiveness unlocked compassion for the person I used to be. She was not weak, she was adapting, surviving, learning. I carry her with me now, not as a burden, but as proof. Proof that growth is possible, even in the most constrained environments. Proof that courage can look like patience until it is ready to look like action. If there is a moral in all of this, it is simple and hard at the same time. You do not owe anyone access to your life at the cost of your well-being. Love that requires your silence is not love. Family that demands your future is not protection, and standing up for yourself is not betrayal. It is alignment. The world may not always applaud that choice, but your soul will recognize it. Immediately as I continue forward, I do so without needing to prove anything. This chapter is complete, not because it ended cleanly, but because I no longer live inside it. I carry the lessons forward, lightly integrated, woven into who I am. I am no longer reacting to the past, I am responding to the present. My life is not perfect, but it is honest, and that honesty is the foundation of everything meaningful I will build next. This is where the story rests. Not in triumph or anger, but in quiet ownership. I stood up, I told the truth. I protected myself, and in doing so, I finally claimed my life.